Hey everybody, welcome back to the Ballpit. We have another reaction video today, and I decided to try something a little different. Typically my reaction videos are about music, but I decided to just kind of dive into one of my other interests, which is politics. I do a little bit of that on the writer's block in some of those episodes if you've seen them. If you haven't, go check them out. But I decided today that I'm just going to react to some Prager U, or Prager, I think it's Prager. Prager U, possibly the worst university you can possibly attend. And, I think it's timely and relevant to react to their video they put out on Monday called Where Are You, Martin Luther King? Before we even get into it, it's important to realize that when conservatives make these type of videos on MLK Day, they're very, very, very rarely, if ever, used to actually honor the memory of the late Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and are more so to leverage his memory and his history to kind of leverage their own political positions, which I think is a little gross to do. And that's what this video is more likely than not going to be. I haven't seen it yet, but more likely than not, they're going to be trying to use Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to make their own political points that much stronger. But I could be completely wrong.
It's been 50 years since Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was shot to death on a motel balcony in Memphis, Tennessee.
Isn't that crazy to think about? Only 50 years ago. Only 50 years ago. And, like, they always try to show Martin Luther King Jr. in photos and such as, like, in black and white. It's like they had color photography back then. It really was not that long ago. My father was alive when Martin Luther King Jr. was killed. All my grandparents were alive. Like, it's really not that long ago.
And over the decades, he has become one of the most revered figures in American history. There is an impressive memorial to him in Washington, D.C., and a museum celebrating his life in Atlanta, Georgia.
Which is valid. It should be the case. Like, if we have Columbus Day as a holiday and kids get off school for Columbus Day, this guy should absolutely have a day and more.
Countless schools and boulevards have been named after him, and a national holiday is dedicated to his memory.
Okay.
How is it then that so much of his legacy, what he hoped to pass on to the future, has been lost?
Yeah, that's a good point. Like his points about the evils of capitalism and how it's hurting the world, how the divide between the upper and the lower class is only widening, and how the redistribution of wealth from a democratic socialist perspective would only benefit the lower class. Stuff like that. It is really upsetting that those kind of points do not have the same impact as some of his other stuff. But, I'm glad, Jason, that you're going to actually talk about how good redistributing wealth is.
Lost. King wanted equality under the law and said, famously, that people ought to judge one another based on character, not skin color.
Okay.
But he also believed that blacks had an important role to play in their own advancement. The black civil rights battles in America are now over. And
the black civil rights battles are now over. What are we talking about? Well, are they really going to make the point that, like, everybody's equal now? Like, it's just not true. It's not inscribed in law that people are equal. The social realities aren't equal. The remnants left over from our history are still there. There's economic inequality, social inequality, like political inequality. What are we even talking about? This is so ridiculous. I hate videos like this.
King's side won.
King's side won. But do you think King's side had one? They're like, once we get this one thing, then we're done. No, Dr. Martin Luther, if he was still alive, he would still be a civil rights advocate if he was not killed, in the same way that Malcolm X would be, or Fred Hampton. Ridiculous.
The best indication of that may be that King has had no real successor. If black Americans were still faced with legitimate threats to civil rights, such as legal discrimination or voter disenfranchisement?
There is both of those things. There is legal discrimination and there is voter disenfranchisement. Absolutely. Absolutely. Voter disenfranchisement is not as intense as it once was, but conservatives continue to fight to make it more prominent. When conservatives talk about requiring ID to go vote, they're attempting to disenfranchise certain groups of people. I've heard multiple conservatives try to make use of like a poll tax, like you need to have a job, or you need to own property, or you need to pay taxes through a job, something like that, to be able to vote. You need to have this level of education. You need to be this, whatever. When you add more qualifications to be able to vote, you are disenfranchising people by nature, because people that don't meet those qualifications now can't vote. And in terms of legal discrimination, there absolutely is legal discrimination for minority parties, specifically Black Americans. For example, police using stop and frisk policies. They stop and frisk Black Americans at an increase of about 30 or 40%. I'll try to include my sources on this one. Increase about 30 or 40%, but those stops are actually left less profitable by a similar percentile margin, meaning that when police officers will stop and frisk, this was a study done in the Carolinas, stop and frisk Black Americans, they're less likely to actually find illegal contraband or weapons than they are on white Americans, but they still stop and frisk Black Americans at a higher margin. What reason do you have for that other than legal discrimination? Legal discrimination doesn't just have to be on a macro level in terms of physically inscribed into law as this race of people is not allowed to do this, or this race of people has to be treated differently. Legal discrimination can also come from people that enforce, write, and judge the laws, our three branches of government, and if they discriminate. If you have your branches of government discriminating against a certain group of people, that's still legal discrimination, because they have an impact on the way that the laws are interpreted, enforced, and written. Even in so much whenever you do like jury studies, they're more likely to convict Black Americans than white Americans for similar crimes. The race is the what would it be? The independent variable. It's been a while since I've taken my stat classes. In that, and it showed that being of a minority racial group means you're more likely to be committed for a similar crime. These are examples of legal discrimination that I'm giving you. What do you mean it doesn't exist? And when you say that there would be a legitimate, this video is going to be so long, it's going to be ridiculous. When you say that there is no legitimate person that stemmed from Martin Luther King, like a modern Martin Luther King Jr., maybe it's because the civil rights groups don't have leaders, like an abject leader in the same way that they did before. Like when you look at the most recent example of protests happening in the United States, let's say for Palestine, right? There is no leader, but because the internet itself and the way that we're able to communicate means that everybody's able to be tuned in together. You don't need to listen to one person to get the news, because you can all kind of do it together. In the same way that in 2020, from the murder of George Floyd and how cities, erupted into protests calling for change, and such, stuff like that. There wasn't really one leader. There wasn't one leader when Martin Luther King was around. To be fair, Malcolm X had his own thing, and he was doing his own thing. Fred Hampton existed. There was multiple people that were still there. He's just the one that we remember the fondest, because the government was able to twist what he said to make it all about peaceful reform, when Martin Luther King really wasn't just about peaceful reform. He even had a quote. It's actually on my Twitter somewhere. Let me pull this up really quick. I saved a quote from him earlier today because I knew that this is the type of video that Prager was going to try to make, because they're incredibly predictable. So Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, "If peace means keeping my mouth shut in the midst of injustice and evil, I don't want it. If peace means a willingness to be exploited economically, dominated politically, humiliated, and segregated, I don't want peace." Martin Luther King Jr. did not believe in only peaceful protest. He believed in protesting in a way that would get you what you needed, what you wanted, whatever you needed to do to stop the segregation and in the case of 2020, murder of black Americans was the way you should protest. All right, rant over. Let's continue.
It's likely that leaders of King's caliber would have emerged to carry on the fight. Instead, what we have today are pretenders who have turned the civil rights movement into an industry, if not a racket.
Oh, God.
And what have these racketeers accomplished? A lot for themselves and very little for their constituents. Racial gaps in income, education, and home ownership were narrowing in the 1940s.
That's crazy to say. They're narrowing in the 1940s. Oh, so you mean, a couple... racial gaps in home ownership and making money have actually been narrowing since the 1860s. Really? Wow, I wonder why. Also, this is not a true chart. Where's the source for this? There's no way. Redlining was literally a practice that, explicitly happened until the 90s.
50s and 60s.
There's
After
no
King
shot.
was replaced as the spokesman for Black America by the likes of Jesse Jackson, Al Sharpton, and others, these gaps began to widen in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s.
Or maybe... Wait. So hold on. Pause. So you're saying that Martin Luther King Jr. not being... didn't you say that Martin Luther King died in 68?
Began to widen in the 1970s.
So 70 was right there. So 68 would have been right there. So it started going down while Martin Luther King was still alive and only continued to do so. Probably, if you were to ask me, first of all, I don't actually believe that this is a correct chart. Yeah, I would need to see a source. Does this even have a source? Nope, no source. Okay, they don't include their source. Cool. This is just a fucking made-up graph, I suppose. So you're suggesting that Martin Luther King being murdered, and the civil rights movement being taken over by people like Jesse Jackson, Al Sharpton, actually made the living conditions in this country worse for black Americans? Which wouldn't that directly go counter your previous point that you made about how there is nothing left to fight for in a civil rights matter and how black Americans are now completely equal to white Americans? Doesn't this directly go against it? You're literally showing that the gap at this point in time is wider than it's been since the 40s, since Jim Crow, essentially.
80s and 90s. This suggests that the racial disparities that continue today aren't driven by whatever racism that still exists, despite...
Racial disparities aren't driven by racism. You're going to have to explain this one to me, buddy. I don't know what they could possibly be driven by.
All the claims to the contrary from progressives and their allies in the media. It also suggests that black culture, attitudes toward marriage, education...
Do these people just believe that culture exists in a vacuum? Do they believe that culture is something that you're born with? You're born into this world and you just have a particular culture that's assigned to you at birth? No, culture is incredibly derivative of the social and economic conditions that you're brought up in. It's completely ridiculous to cite culture as the reason for the disparity and not disparity as the reason for the culture. Ultimately, the culture would have existed because of the social and economic conditions first.
Work and the rule of law plays a much larger role than the left wants to acknowledge. More marches won't address fatherless homes.
More marches won't address fatherless homes. Well, then what will address fatherless homes? What's the solution here, huh? What's the solution? And, actually, more marches might address fatherless homes if we can get cops to stop executing black men, on the street. That would probably actually help with putting fathers into homes, believe it or not.
More sit-ins won't lower black crime rates.
Again, crime rates are incredibly indicative of the economic and social conditions that a group of people live in. That's in the same way that, earlier in American history, the Irish crime rates were higher than black crime rates have ever been. The Italian crime rates were higher than black crime rates ever have been because those groups were in incredibly poor social and economic conditions. There's a sociological theory. I'm a sociologist. I have to remember what it's called. I forgot, but it's basically I'll put the name of it on like the screen somewhere. But it's a zoning theory that suggests that in every single city there are zones. In the middle of the city is like the business district, and then there's zone 1, zone 2, zone 3. And as you exit the city, the zone number gets higher. The theory is the lower number zones that you are in, if you live in them, means that there's a higher chance of you committing a crime, or the people in there will have higher crime rates just than other people, because the closer you are to the city, the lower number of zone you're in, the worse your economic and social conditions are, meaning you're actually more likely to commit crime, because poverty and crime are intrinsically related. But they won't say that. They won't say that. They're going to make this a problem that only relates to black Americans because it fits their point. They're going to forget what happened to the Irish and the Italians whenever they were immigrating over. They're going to forget about it because it does not fit with their point. However, it stands that poverty and crime are intrinsically related. And if you have a group of people that live in zone 1, the poorest zone, they're going to have the highest crime rate, which proves that relationship.
Or narrow the school achievement gap.
What does that mean? What is the school achievement gap? Can you explain? What is... Okay, looks like we're going back to Google. What is the school achievement gap? The achievement gap is the persistent disparity in academic achievement between minority and disadvantaged students and their white counterparts. So the idea is that like white students score higher on like SATs and like just do better academically than black children. There's a lot of reasons for that. Almost none of which are culture. In a lot of ways, where if you're poor, which we know at this point that black Americans are more likely to be in poverty than white Americans, we know that it's harder because, everybody in the family is going to have to work. There are no stay-at-home moms in these poorer families because they have to go work. Who's going to teach the kid this stuff? Who's going to do that? When you have property taxes that pay for your schooling and you're in a low-income area, there's less tax money going to that school. Means the educators aren't better. There's a lot of reasons that describe this more than just culture. That's completely ridiculous to ascribe that culture is the only thing that affects all three of the things you just mentioned. Completely ridiculous, and it shows a complete ignorance to the social realities that we're currently in.
Achievement gap. Electing more black politicians and appointing more black government officials can't compensate for these cultural deficiencies either. Black mayors, congressmen, senators, police chiefs, and school superintendents have become commonplace since the 1970s.
Have become commonplace. Commonplace. That's crazy. They've become commonplace. What is even the point here? What's even the point?
Even the election of a black president, twice, failed to close the racial divide in many key measures.
Yeah.
Black-white differences in poverty, home ownership, and incomes all grew wider under President Obama.
Because history, there's a reason that we study history, right? A lot of people will ascribe the importance of history to saying, oh, it's so we don't make the same mistakes again. That's not the reason we study history. It shouldn't be. It's not the reason we study history. The reason we study history is because the events that happened in the past directly impact what we currently live in today. The effect of redlining and Richard Rothstein. I actually have this book right back. Hold on. Let me go grab it. Here we go. I found it. Great book. One of my favorite books ever. Oh, let me put it in the camera. Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. Great book. Richard Rothstein's a phenomenal sociologist, and this book is amazing. Describes the impact that redlining had. It describes what redlining is, which is essentially, in short, it's essentially a planned and purposeful lack of ability to get loans or money to purchase property, or just being refused from purchasing property in general for black families and black homeowners or potential homeowners, forcing them to either purchase property in worse property in worse areas, or forcing them to rent, which has directly impacted the generational wealth that black families have over white families and still impacts the world to this day. This book, Color of Law, it's down there now. Great book, and describes exactly why maybe the economic gaps between black and white families in terms of poverty, homeownership, and incomes are the way they are because of historical racism. Is literally what that book is about. Phenomenal book. I'm going to see if I can include in the description maybe a free on like YouTube or something seminar or something that Richard Rothstein has given to talk about it, so you guys don't have to purchase the book yourself to be able to learn what Richard Rothstein is talking about in the book. Just because I know not everybody has the means to just purchase books all the time, and providing free resources is very helpful. So I will try to remember to do that in the description.
Discussion of antisocial behavior in poor black communities, let alone the possibility that it plays a significant role in racial inequality, has become another casualty of the post-60s era. King and other black leaders at the time spoke openly about the need for more responsible behavior. After remarking on the disproportionately high inner-city crime rates, King told...
Again. You know what? I'm just going to actually just, while we're in this, where I'm just looking shit up, I'm just going to look up what the theory name is there. It's called Concentric Zone Theory, which breaks down the different zones that consist of in a city. And it shows that, Zone 1, as I said before, is the business district of most cities, department stores, skyscrapers, office buildings, hotels, city government, etc., etc., etc. And it said Zone 2 became an area of rundown housing occupied by the newly arrived immigrants and the poor. These deteriorating neighborhoods became the new home for the majority of troubled youth. This is where the cheap housing was. This is where they had the ability to live. This is where the crime rates were the highest. This is the same for every single group that is lived in Zone 2, whether it is the Irish, the Italians, or now black Americans. It is the same. It is the same. And, a large reason why black Americans are still in those zones to this day is described in A Color of Law by Richard Rothstein.
Told a black congregation in St. Louis that we've got to do something about our moral standards. We know that there are many things wrong in the white world, he said, but there are many things wrong in the black world, too.
Okay.
We can't keep on blaming the white man. There are things we must do for ourselves. The pretenders...
Well, so the point of that is that Martin Luther King understood that black families and the black community as a whole weren't going to get help from the whites because the whites are the reason they're there in the first place. That's essentially what Malcolm X's whole shtick was. Well, and the Black Panthers was they're going to provide for the black community in a way that the government refused to. And they got killed for it. The FBI didn't like that. So that was that point being made. Is that you can't rely on the white man because they put us here. They mean to keep us here. If we want to escape from that, we have to do it ourselves. That's the point. But the thing is you can't expect a community to uplift themselves when they're constantly being pushed down by historical racist economic measures. It's ridiculous.
To King's legacy mostly ignore this advice, preferring instead to keep the onus on whites. Where King tried to instill the importance of personal responsibility and self-determination, his counterparts today spend more time making excuses for counterproductive behavior and dismissing any criticism of it as racist.
Make excuses of counterproductive behavior. You mean actual sociological studies that are backed up by years or even decades of research that has been verified through statistical means by running a variety of tests, looking at the alpha levels, have been conflicted. Actual research that has been done is an excuse. What's your research? Where are your numbers? Where's your proof, actually? You're just talking. You don't even provide sources for charts. How could you not provide sources, or even if they're your own charts that you guys have put together, where are you getting the numbers from? You have to put that, or else your chart is shit and means nothing. It's ridiculous.
Activists who long ago abandoned King's colorblind standard, which was the basis for the landmark civil rights laws enacted in the 1960s, tell young Black Americans today that they are victims first and foremost. White society is against you, they say, even if you have no clear examples of discrimination to point to.
I've literally mentioned clear examples of discrimination, at least 5 different ones during this video. So how about those ones? And you know what? Actually, they're not allowed to talk about that. Teachers aren't allowed to bring up any of the stuff I just mentioned. In like Florida, probably, because that's where they actually have the laws about it. You can't bring up redlining. You can't bring up probably Martin Luther King Jr.'s communist side. You can't bring up maybe work done by Elijah Anderson, like Black and White Space, which is a phenomenal book, another phenomenal sociological text. Probably can't bring up stuff from Cornel West or Kendi, I think Ibram, Ibram Kendi, another great sociologist. These, not Richard Rothstein, that's a white man, but Cornel West, Elijah Anderson stuff, these are people that you could see as the predecessors of Martin Luther King. They're looking at the research and trying to show people the discrimination that still exists towards these minority racial groups, specifically Black Americans in this country. It's people like Prager and their listeners that won't listen. That won't listen to reason or proof because their biases do the talking for them.
They are told that fire hoses and poll taxes have been replaced by unconscious racism, white privilege, and microaggressions.
So unconscious racism is a thing. What is it called? IAT, Implicit Associations Test. Go take an IAT right now. Actually, I bet I could look one up and find. I'll put one in the description if I do. Unconscious racism or implicit bias has actually been shown to matter in something I mentioned before, such as in jury trials, how the jury is more likely to be harsh on Black defendants than they are white defendants, and stuff like that is a result from unconscious racism. You're just more likely to be harsher on them and think more harshly. Even a Black jury is likely to have negative associations with Black defendants over white defendants because of the way that the media and the culture of this country and everything else has ascribed to Black Americans. Unconscious racism is a real thing, and the implicit associations test describes that. It shows that. It proves it. White privilege is also a thing. The whole idea is that if you're in the same position, a white person and a Black person in the same position, the Black person is going to face more social hurdles than the white person because of their race. Race is the independent variable in this measure. It's the one that you change. Everything else remains the same. Outcomes are going to be different. That's not to say that it is impossible for Black Americans to be successful. That would be ridiculous. There are plenty of examples of successful Black Americans. The fact of the matter is that it is harder to succeed as a Black American because of the social hurdles. And it means that if a Black American does succeed on a wide margin, it more likely than not means that they've had to work a lot harder than a white person in a similar position would have. And microaggressions, conservatives love to complain about microaggressions. They really do. They love to talk about safe spaces and the microaggressions and triggers. I don't think that they're that important to talk about. I think that, honestly, bringing them up would be getting away from the plot a little bit. So I will digress. All I know is I personally just want to try to make everybody as comfortable as possible. I don't want to make anybody feel comfortable when I'm in a conversation with them or talking to them or whatever else. So,
a generation of Blacks who have more opportunity than any previous generation are being taught that America offers them little more than bigoted teachers, biased employers, and trigger-happy cops.
Well, okay, so this generation of Black Americans has more opportunity than past generations. That's true. That is true. That is true. Because think about the past in the United States for Black Americans. Slavery. After slavery, you had like sharecropping and stuff like that. You had the Jim Crow South. after Jim Crow, you had your redlining until the 90s, stuff like that. So yeah, there is more opportunity than ever before, but that doesn't mean that bigoted teachers, biased employers, and trigger-happy cops aren't something that you have to legitimately watch out for. Again, I'm not black, so I can't verify this. I can't speak from lived experience, but from just what I've read and what I've heard, especially Black and White Space. I think I had that book online. I had it in an ebook. Black and White Space by Elijah Anderson, great book. Describes some of this. It describes biased employers. It describes trigger-happy cops, or just discriminatory cops and such like that. And just the lived experience of Elijah Anderson and other black individuals that he interviewed, talking about what it's like being black in white spaces. And so this is a social reality, even if there's more opportunity than ever before for black Americans. To say that these don't exist is ignorant of the realities.
It's not only a lie, but as King understood, it's also self-destructive. Black activists and white progressives stress racism because it serves their own interest, not because it actually improves the station of blacks.
What are their interests? What are their interests? And it doesn't improve the station of the black community because nothing's done about it. That's the problem. If you complain about a problem and nothing is done to solve the problem whenever it's brought to people's attention or complained about, then yeah, of course no improvements can be made. Because all we're doing is make people aware of a problem, they're not fixing it. The improvement would come if people actually listened to these protests and tried to fix the problems. But that won't happen.
Neglect of the role that blacks must themselves play in writing their own lives can only make matters worse. A half-century after King's death, plenty of people are paying him lip service. Far too few are following his example. I'm Jason Riley of the Manhattan Institute for Prager University. Thank you for watching this video.
Yeah, we're not subscribing to the channel. We're not doing that. We're not. We're and closed. And over here. All right. That's the end of the video. It's a long one. I don't know how I just took like a 5-minute reaction video and reacted to it for almost 35 minutes. It's a bit crazy. 7 minutes of me talking for every 1 minute of actual footage from PragerU. But this kind of thing happens. So thank you guys so much for watching. I appreciate all the support. My hair is a mess today. Let me know if you want more kind of political stuff or whatever from me. It's a bit of putting myself out there a bit with this one. Something I'm not super used to or comfortable with, but we'll see what happens. Thank you again. Hope you have a great rest of your day.